Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video it is something very exciting because I'll be talking about this camera right here. It's the Nikon D70. Yes, it's the very same camera from earlier this month where the challenge was to actually get a camera under 50 euros, well, a camera setup under 50 euros within 24 hours and then make a video about it. It's that very same camera and very same camera setup, of course, and if you haven't watched it, I recommend you watching it because in that video, I also talked briefly about this camera and also just went through the challenges, give you some tips and tricks on actually, search for camera setup for that price as well, where to look, things like that, and also went out and actually took pictures with this camera as well. But in this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on using this camera, and so far has been very positive. Of course, there's some negative with this camera as well, being an old tech, and of course not every camera is made for a person. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Nikon D70, now this camera came out way back in 2004, I believe, and a year after that there was this D70S, which didn't really bring that much to the table. The most improvement I think I remember was the bigger screen at 2 inches, where this is only 1.8 inch. But in this video we'll just be talking about this camera, but I did make a video about the D70S earlier, and you can actually check that out as well if you want, just to compare if it's really worth that extra bit of upgrade, whereas usually the D70S is actually much cheaper anyway. But anyway, back into this video. Just like in most of my other My Thought videos on different cameras, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. The first one is the operational side of things, the ergonomics, the usability, then going down into the image quality, and then down into my conclusion just to end the video. And before I go into all those 3 sections, let me just make it clear, this is an old camera. It does not take video. It's too old of a DSLR to actually take video. Because I've been getting a lot of messages lately if the 30D takes video, if the D200 takes video, if the D1X takes videos, things like that. No, this camera does not take video, just to save some of you some time. But otherwise, let's dive into the operational side and the ergonomics of this camera. Well, the ergonomics of this camera is actually really nice. I love how balanced this camera feels. I love the grip that is actually quite big. Yes, it does feel a little bit plasticky, but it actually still feels quite nice and very grippy on this grip. And of course most of the controls are actually just at your fingertips, which is actually quite nice. I also like the CF card slot right here because my favorite media is actually CF cards. And of course I like the door here. I don't like the side doors on the side of the grip. I actually much prefer the door on the inner part, which is actually quite nice, but the door does feel a bit flimsy as well. Just to keep that in mind. But otherwise, it's actually a very nice build quality camera. Yes, it feels plasticky, but actually it does feel like really solid as well in the same time, and very comfortable. And talking about comfortable, even in cold weather where you're wearing gloves, I personally find it's still very nice and ergonomical camera to actually operate with gloves, so you can actually still press most of the buttons quite nice, and you do feel that bit of tactile feedback as well, and the mode dial doesn't actually flip that easily, so that's actually quite nice. And going up to the camera, the flash, it's really nice that there's this really high and further away built-in flash, because if you're taking portraits at night, it actually helped to reduce red eye effect as well, so that's actually quite good. And yeah, otherwise I really love the control. Everything is at your fingertips, and most of the essential settings are also at your fingertips. Whether it's the ISO, although I wish that the ISO would be up here rather than here behind, well, the screen, and also kind of in front of my nose if I'm composing for an image, things like that. Yeah, it's actually a really nicely thought out and designed camera. The only downside about this camera I personally find is, at least it's just coming from me because I don't really generally like having AF assist light, is the AF assist light. It's really annoying. You have to turn, well, I turn it off in the actual settings, but of course if you're photographing in low light, it's actually very useful to have this light ready. Just be careful that if you're photographing portraits, you could be blinding your model at night, of course. So yeah, just to keep that in mind. But otherwise, I really like it, and well, I really like the operational side of this camera. In the viewfinder, even though it's a very small and kind of dark viewfinder, but you do have a decent 5-point AF in there, 5 autofocusing points in there, which actually works quite decent. So if you're not photographing a lot of moving subjects, then this autofocusing system will be fine. If you're just focusing, you know, on simple portraits where you might be moving just minutely, things like that, this autofocusing system will also be adequate for that as well. Otherwise, if it's too much moving, then it really could confuse this autofocusing system quite a bit. And also if the scene has too much contrast or has too much patterns, then it also will confuse the autofocusing system in here a little bit. But otherwise, in normal circumstances or in normal situations, I find that the autofocusing system is more than good enough, and just keeps up enough even in low light situation like this. So yeah, and I also sometimes like to take this camera out to do like night photography or night cityscape photography, and to be honest, in most cases the autofocusing system is actually good enough to just focus on the subject. So that's actually quite nice as well. But if you're doing something like street photography, I'm not quite sure. It's still quite hit and miss with this camera, so just keep that in mind. But otherwise, it's a very nice camera to operate. It's decently fast, not only in terms of operation, but also in terms of the burst rate. So this camera actually is able to shoot up to 3 frames per second, so that's actually quite good as well. What I like about this camera as well is having the top LCD. It's actually quite nice. So within this price range, you usually look at a lot of entry-level DSLRs as well, whereas with this camera, it's obviously a kind of the lower end semi-professional camera from Nikon, but it is still, you know, packed with a lot of controls and features, especially for the time that it was released, so it's actually quite nice. But being a camera that's super photography centric and very stripped down also actually means that you're going to be focusing more on your shots rather than what the camera can actually do. So that's actually quite nice. The downside is that this camera shoots at 3 frames per second, but of course, for back then it was quite fast, but for a semi-professional, for some of you, it might not be fast enough. That being said, personally for me, for what I shoot with this camera, 3 frames per second is actually more than enough. And of course, with the autofocusing system in this camera not being so fast, it means that essentially even 1 frames per second on this camera is more than good enough. So yeah, there is that. And my last point before we dive into the image quality is the battery life. The battery life on this camera is actually quite nice. After charging it for like at least the past week, the battery is still full. So yeah, it just goes to show, you know, with such an old technology, it doesn't require a lot of battery to, you know, power the camera or to operate the camera. So even working in at least the past week between the temperature of -3 to -5 degrees, this camera actually holds up actually quite fine, and the battery life is still full. And not to mention the battery is actually quite old already. So yeah, there's that. So I overall really like operating with this camera. It's very reliable, and of course it doesn't really fail even in super cold condition. So yeah, there's that. And now moving into the image quality. The image quality on this camera, well, if you like really nostalgic digital look or vibe, then this camera is another camera to consider, because the color rendition, the color science on this camera is actually quite nice with the older CCD sensor in this camera. The color temperature you get from this camera is also kind of very interesting, kind of cool temperature look, which is really nice. And there's that faded look that you get from the older digital camera, because, you know, with the older digital cameras, don't forget that they were actually, well, the companies like Canon, Nikon, Pentax were just trying to win over photographers from the film era, so they also try to mimic the look as close as possible to a film, some sort of film look as well. So there's that bit of matte faded look to the image as well, so it's quite nostalgic digital feel as well, so that's actually quite nice. And of course, the noise character in this camera. If you care a lot about noise, don't use over ISO 400. At least that's my standard, because over ISO 400 is just way too noisy already, especially if you do even a little bit of post-processing. But if you don't do a lot of post-processing, then maybe ISO 640 or 800 is still doable with this camera, maybe with just ever so slightly light touches. But of course, I usually just shoot in RAW, so I do have a little bit of advantage there as well, of having the file a bit more under control myself. So yeah, there's that. If you're shooting mainly JPEG, just be careful because the file gets baked a little bit and pre-edited from the processor. So yeah, there's that, just to keep that in mind. But otherwise, the color science of this camera is really nice. Of course, being an old sensor, the dynamic range is not as good, and of course you will get sometimes the Moraine aliasing, so be careful. Don't shoot a lot into the complex pattern kind of situations or complex patterns objects. Yeah, just look out for those as well. But otherwise, yeah, if you know what you're doing, if you're not photographing in too high contrasted areas, then the images will actually turn out really great. Unless if you're really going for a super high contrasted look, then of course feel free to actually shoot in high contrasted areas. But yeah. Whew. But another downside, it's also somewhat related to the dynamic range, but also like with the long exposure. What I find that when I take long exposure with this camera, the image just does not capture as much detail as even cameras like the D40. The D40 is able to actually capture more detail than this camera. It has the same megapixel count, but I'm not sure if it has the same sensor or not, because they could actually just develop new 6 megapixel sensor from ground up as well for that camera, being that it also has a different image processor, I think. So yeah, there's that. So just be careful when you shoot at night. You will lose some of the details, whereas even cameras from 8 or 9 years ago will be able to maintain much more detail in long exposures compared to this camera. So yeah, but of course, if you're really just wanting to experiment with the look of the older digital look, then this camera is a very nice camera with also very nice skin tone rendition as well. So yeah, that's actually quite nice. So if you want to, you know, do some sort of nostalgic feel of portrait shoot, I also highly recommend this camera as well. So yeah, there's that. Otherwise, the contrast control is also quite nice, and there is also quite nice sharpness to the sensor as well, from the image quality that you get with the sensor. So yeah, there is that. Now on to the conclusion. So overall, I really love using this camera. Of course, knowing its limitation is a huge advantage, because obviously you're not going to be putting yourself and the camera into a lot of stressful environment. You're just going to be getting the images that you know how it will turn out, because you know you properly planned it. You know the, well, not necessarily have to be properly planned, but just knowing the actual weakness of the camera will actually already allow you to work around the limitations of the camera, and therefore get a lot of good results with the camera. Yeah, otherwise this camera is also a really nice just photography focused camera, because a lot of the more modern DSLRs has a lot of gimmick, has a lot of features, and with this camera being just a bare bone photography camera means that you will just be focusing on just the scene you're photographing, the story you're capturing, the story you're documenting, things like that, rather than, you know, trying to get a technically sound image. You're just going to be focusing more on the story side of things, on the conceptualization side of things, on the moment. So it does give you a different kind of mindset with this camera, and also it kind of also trains your head to just work around the limitations and just focusing on the exposure triangle as well. So that's actually quite nice. So yeah, overall I do highly recommend this camera. Overall, it's just another budget camera that it's not, you know, it doesn't hurt to actually experiment and dip your toes into, because at the end of the day, 6 megapixel is still a lot. You still can get really clean A3 print with it, and of course you can still do light editing with it as well, and light manipulation with the images. And yeah, overall it doesn't hurt to experiment, especially if you're really into experimentation. So yeah, I hope this video has helped you somewhat. There were definitely way more information in my budget photography video, that, you know, the challenge video on this camera, so feel free to actually check that out as well. Otherwise, if you need a free photography guidebook, it's absolutely for free on my website. The link is down in the description section below. If you have any recommendations, any suggestions, feel free to also just comment down in the comment section below as well. Otherwise, my courses are also up online, and feel free to check that out. More free courses are also coming by early 2024, as well as more advanced courses are also coming in early 2024 as well. I'm just editing them and also planning the last bits of those courses. Oh yeah, and one more thing I forgot to mention about this camera is that you can actually experiment by using older lenses with this camera as well, because there is a motor that drives older Nikon lenses as well. So there's always that perk with this camera. And otherwise, yeah, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.